The truth about why you lose motivation before you start. You say you're going to change. You've said it before, maybe last week, maybe last night, maybe in the mirror this morning. You meant it, you felt it, you even believed it for a moment. But then that moment passed. Suddenly you're scrolling, rechecking your inbox, opening tabs you've already read. And somewhere deep inside, that familiar voice returns. Why am I like this? It's easy to call it laziness. It's even easier to blame distraction, burnout, a lack of discipline. That narrative is everywhere, that if you wanted it badly enough, you'd already be doing it. That your hesitation is proof you're not serious, not focused, not built for it. But that's not the truth, not even close. What's really happening isn't a failure of will, it's a system misfiring. Your brain, your nervous system, your emotional memory, all doing exactly what they were trained to do. Protect you from discomfort, threat, uncertainty, and identity conflict. Not the kind of threat that's easy to spot, like danger or pain, but the kind that's quiet, internal, invisible. The kind that disguises itself as procrastination, overthinking, emotional fatigue. The kind that disconnects you from action, not because you're lazy, but because deep down, starting feels unsafe. And until you understand that, until you see exactly how your brain hijacks your drive before you begin, you'll keep blaming the wrong thing. You'll keep using strategies that were never built for the real problem. You'll keep trying to force yourself through resistance that was never meant to be pushed, but understood. This video isn't about hyping you up. It's about showing you the mechanism that's been quietly running the show. Because once you see it, you can change how you respond to it. And when that changes, your relationship with action, momentum, and motivation transforms. We're not here to fix your mindset. We're here to decode the protective loop that's been stopping you before you even begin. This is the truth about why you keep losing motivation. And what needs to shift isn't your strength, it's your clarity. Let's start. The real collapse happens before you begin. Most people think they lose motivation during the process, somewhere in the middle when things get hard. But if you look closer, you'll see the collapse doesn't happen halfway through. It happens before you even take the first step. The moment you say, I'm going to start, something in your system quietly unravels. You feel it, a pause, a shift. Something internal just pulls you away. And unless you're paying attention, it looks like nothing. You get up to do the thing, and suddenly you're checking your phone, tidying your desk, looking for something to snack on, telling yourself, just 5 more minutes. The collapse happens so subtly, so quietly that it doesn't even feel like resistance. It feels like distraction, like disinterest, like emotional static. But behind all of it, there's a deeper loop unfolding, one your brain has learned to run over and over. Here's what's actually happening. When you imagine starting something meaningful, your brain fires up a simulation of the task. This alone can trigger a dopamine response, not because you've achieved anything, but because you've anticipated the achievement. In a healthy system, that anticipation would drive you forward. But when that dopamine spike is too strong or comes too soon, your nervous system gets confused. It thinks the goal has already been partially achieved. The urgency dissolves. The drive disappears. And you're left wondering where your energy went. But that's only half the story. The other half is what your body remembers. And your body remembers everything. If effort has been linked to discomfort, if action has been met with pressure, judgment, or past failure, your nervous system doesn't see starting as neutral. It sees it as risky. Maybe not logically, but emotionally. And in that moment, the resistance you feel isn't about the task. It's about what the task represents. Exposure, rejection, vulnerability, the risk of trying and still not being enough. So your system does what it was trained to do. It redirects your focus, not aggressively but subtly, a yawn, a notification, a sudden need to fix something. All of it perfectly timed to protect you from emotional friction. The problem is, it doesn't feel like protection. It just feels like failure. And that's what keeps the loop alive: the guilt, the shame, the narrative that says, "This is my fault." It's not your fault, it's a pattern. One you didn't create on purpose, but one you're responsible for breaking. And you can't break a pattern you haven't named. So let's name it. You're not resisting the action itself. You're resisting the emotional meaning attached to that action. And unless you separate those two things, you'll keep confusing your nervous system's protective reflex for your own lack of drive. This chapter isn't about fixing your habits. It's about exposing the moment before the habit has a chance to begin. The moment where momentum dies in silence, not because you don't care, but because your system is doing exactly what it was trained to do: protect you from perceived threat. The good news is, perception can be reprogrammed, but only after it's been made conscious. The brain doesn't want growth, it wants safety. It's easy to believe your brain is on your side, that it wants your success, your evolution, your transformation, and in some ways, it does. But only if that growth doesn't threaten something it values more: safety. Not conscious safety, predictive safety. The kind that says, "I know what to expect, and that's enough." From a biological standpoint, the brain doesn't prioritize what's meaningful. It prioritizes what's familiar, even if what's familiar is miserable, even if it's making you anxious, stuck, or ashamed. If it's known, if it's predictable, it feels safe. And anything that threatens to disrupt that predictability, even something healthy, gets flagged as a potential danger. This is why growth often feels hard, not just physically, but emotionally. Not because the task itself is impossible, but because every step forward disrupts the story your brain has memorized about who you are and how the world works. That story may be outdated. It may be false. But it's familiar, and your nervous system clings to familiarity like a survival rope. This is especially true when your growth requires changing how you see yourself. Because identity is the foundation of psychological safety. If you've spent years believing you're inconsistent, undisciplined, or the kind of person who starts things but doesn't finish them, then doing the opposite isn't just a new behavior. It's a threat to the version of you your brain has been protecting. And that's when subtle resistance kicks in. You feel tired before you start, foggy, vaguely off. You think maybe you didn't sleep well. Maybe you need more caffeine, more structure, more time. But what you actually need is to understand that your system is entering protective mode, not because you're in danger, but because you're unfamiliar to yourself. The limbic system, the emotional command center of your brain, doesn't respond to logic. It responds to pattern recognition. If the present moment resembles something emotionally risky from the past, your body won't wait to double check. It will react. And often, that reaction looks like procrastination, avoidance, or sudden urgency in unrelated areas of your life. You don't clean the kitchen or check email because those things matter more. You do it because they feel safe, known, identity compatible, predictable. In that moment, your system isn't failing. It's succeeding at keeping you in a version of life where the emotional outcome feels controllable. This is what people misunderstand about change. They think it's about motivation. But it's not. It's about perceived safety inside the nervous system. And if the new behavior, the new goal, the new identity doesn't feel safe, it doesn't matter how smart or capable you are. Your system will protect you from moving forward. So before you judge your lack of progress, ask a different question. Not what's wrong with me, but what part of me believes that staying the same is safer than evolving? Until you answer that question, you'll keep mistaking your brain's need for control as a failure of character. And you'll keep fighting for your future self, while your nervous system clings to your past one. Willpower isn't what you're missing. It's what you're burning out. You've been taught to think of willpower as the missing ingredient. The final piece. The switch you haven't flipped. You look at people who seem consistent, focused, driven, and assume they have something you don't. Strength, grit, control. But here's what most people miss. Willpower is not a strategy. It's a short-term tool. And if you keep using it to force yourself through unresolved internal resistance, it doesn't make you stronger. It makes you exhausted. Willpower is like a mental override button. You press it when something doesn't feel good, but you want to do it anyway. It can get you through a workout, a deadline, a hard conversation. But it was never meant to carry you day after day through a reality that your nervous system is actively resisting. And that's exactly how most people try to use it. When your mind is pulling you one way and your emotional system is pulling you another, you end up in constant conflict. And that conflict has a cost. It drains energy, fragments attention, and slowly builds resentment, not just toward the task, but toward yourself. Every time you push through without understanding the resistance, you reinforce a message deep in your system. Doing hard things means betraying how I feel. And over time, your body starts pushing back harder. That pushback doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it shows up as burnout, fatigue, indifference. Other times, it's distraction disguised as productivity. You do 10 small things that don't matter, just to avoid the one thing that does. And through it all, you keep telling yourself the same story. I just need more willpower. But you don't. You need alignment. True consistency comes not from pushing harder, but from making decisions that don't require internal conflict to sustain. When your actions are emotionally compatible with how you see yourself, and when they don't trigger unconscious fear or pressure, you don't need to force them. They flow, they feel neutral. Even when they're challenging, they don't require you to abandon your nervous system in order to begin. This is what most high-performing people have learned, even if they don't realize it. Their behaviors fit their identity. There's less resistance because there's less friction between intention and self-perception. The action matches the internal story. And when that happens, momentum becomes self-reinforcing. Not because they're superhuman, but because they're not constantly at war with themselves. So the next time you feel yourself gearing up for another push pause, ask yourself, is this action something my system can support? Or am I trying to override a message I haven't listened to yet? Because if every step forward feels like a fight, maybe the answer isn't more power. Maybe it's less resistance. The hidden loyalty that keeps you stuck. There's a part of you that wants to grow, deeply, honestly. You feel it when you imagine the future you could build. You picture yourself being consistent, focused, clear, the version of you who follows through, who shows up, who doesn't keep circling the same unresolved beginning. But there's another part of you, quieter, older, that pulls in the opposite direction. Not because it wants to sabotage you, but because it's still loyal to the version of you that survived without changing. This is the loyalty nobody talks about. The invisible attachment to who you've been, even when that version no longer fits, even when it's making you miserable. When you've lived with certain identities for years, I procrastinate, I overthink, I never finish anything. Those labels become more than stories, they become anchors. And even if consciously you're ready to let them go, your nervous system might still believe that those patterns are what kept you emotionally safe. That not trying too hard protected you from failure. That playing small kept you close to people who needed you to be less. That staying invisible kept you from judgment you weren't ready to handle. So now when you try to move forward, your system isn't resisting growth. It's resisting the death of a familiar identity. And that resistance doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like fatigue, indecision, sudden discomfort, or even guilt. Because part of you believes that evolving means leaving something behind. And it does. Growth is loss. You lose the comfort of being the person who doesn't take risks. You lose the excuse that says, I'm just not that type of person. You lose the shield of being misunderstood, overlooked, underestimated. And strangely, those things may have once felt like safety. So of course there's hesitation. That hesitation isn't weakness. It's grief. It's the nervous system catching up to a new identity that hasn't been emotionally integrated yet. And unless you acknowledge that grief, it becomes resistance. Because you're not just changing behavior, you're untangling from a version of yourself that's been with you for years. And here's the hardest part. That version of you wasn't wrong. It wasn't broken. It was adaptive. It got you here. And it did so by prioritizing what you needed most at the time: acceptance, approval, safety. But you're not in that chapter anymore. And what once protected you is now keeping you stuck. Letting go of that loyalty doesn't mean erasing the past. It means updating it. Thanking it, releasing it with clarity, not rejection. You're not sabotaging yourself. You're protecting something that used to matter. The key now is to make a conscious choice. What matters more? Loyalty to who I was, or responsibility for who I'm becoming? Because you can't build a new identity while secretly grieving the loss of the old one in silence. How dopamine hijacks your motivation before you begin. You've been told that dopamine is what drives you. That it's the neurochemical of motivation, pleasure, and reward. And that's partly true, but dangerously incomplete. Because what most people don't realize is this: dopamine doesn't reward achievement. It rewards the anticipation of progress. And in the modern world, that anticipation gets triggered constantly, without any real movement ever happening. Every time you imagine yourself doing something important, cleaning your space, finishing that project, going to the gym, your brain releases a small pulse of dopamine, not because you did it, but because you thought about doing it. Your mind simulates the experience, the brain celebrates the idea, and your body relaxes. The loop feels closed. The urgency fades, and suddenly, starting feels harder than ever. Why? Because chemically, your system thinks you've already made progress. That feeling of satisfaction you got from watching a video about productivity, from writing out your to-do list in perfect order, that was dopamine. And now, without even realizing it, the tension to act has been neutralized by an illusion of action. This is what kills motivation before it begins. Not laziness, not indecision. A misfire in the brain's reward prediction system. You're not resisting action. You're acting on the false sense that something's already been accomplished. And the longer you loop through this cycle, the more your system gets trained to crave the simulation over the execution. This is why planning can feel more satisfying than starting. Why watching someone else succeed feels inspiring but leaves you inert. Why your brain prefers the safe, low-cost dopamine hit of thinking about progress over the slow, uncertain process of actually earning it. The irony is, dopamine isn't the problem. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do: reward pursuit. The issue is that modern life gives us endless ways to simulate pursuit, without ever confronting the vulnerability of effort. So what do? You interrupt the loop. You stop linking dopamine to fantasy and start linking it to reality. You give your brain a new source of reward. Not ideas, not outcomes, but motion. Actual, physical, completed motion. A short walk. A page written. A drawer cleaned. A task checked off not because it's big, but because it's real. When dopamine becomes dependent on execution, everything shifts. The system resets. You start to crave follow-through, not just the idea of success. And over time, your motivation becomes anchored in evidence, not illusion. This is how you rewire the system. You stop letting your brain mistake anticipation for progress. You stop rewarding yourself for starting in your head. And you start teaching your system, we don't celebrate the idea, we celebrate the act. Emotional safety, the real reason you can't start. Most people don't realize that the moment they avoid action, their nervous system is already in motion, not toward laziness, not toward distraction, but toward protection. Because somewhere in your history, maybe years ago, maybe in small unnoticed ways, starting became linked to pain. Not physical pain, but emotional threat, failure, disappointment, rejection, humiliation. And your body remembers that. The problem is that memory doesn't live in your thoughts. It lives in your biology. So when you sit down to start something new or meaningful, your brain doesn't just see a task. It sees a potential emotional event, one that could destabilize the image you have of yourself or how others see you, one that could trigger old feelings you've worked hard to avoid. And without your permission, your body reacts. Subtle tension in your chest, tightness in your stomach, a vague restlessness. Your system says, let's not do this right now. This is where most people misunderstand resistance. They try to outsmart it, force their way through it, layer on discipline and motivation as if the issue were effort, when in fact, it's emotional safety. Because the truth is, your brain will not allow consistent action in an environment it perceives as threatening, even if that environment is entirely internal. You may think you're avoiding the task, but what you're actually avoiding is what the task represents: being seen, making a mistake, starting something and not finishing it, confirming a fear you've carried quietly, that maybe you're not as capable as you thought. So your brain steps in, not with a dramatic shutdown, but with quiet diversions. Check your messages first. You need to clean up before you begin. Maybe you're too tired today. These aren't excuses, they're nervous system regulation strategies. The brain is trying to get you back to emotional neutrality by steering you away from potential threat. But here's the paradox. You can't think your way into safety, and you can't logic your way out of fear. Because the emotion isn't based on present danger, it's based on past imprint. And unless you rewire that association, you'll keep freezing. No matter how badly you want to move forward, the solution isn't more discipline. It's restoring trust between effort and safety. It's creating small moments of motion that prove to your system, trying doesn't mean breaking. That starting doesn't lead to collapse. That doing something imperfectly doesn't erase your value. You do this by lowering the emotional cost of action. You strip the task of pressure. You remove the expectation of performance. You make space to begin without demanding that you be great at it. And you do it consistently, not to prove something to the world, but to reteach your body that movement is no longer a threat. Over time, your nervous system starts to get the message. It's okay now. It's different this time. And when your body feels safe, your mind no longer needs to convince itself to act. It just moves, quietly, clearly, without a fight. Readiness is a myth. You need to move before you feel ready. You've probably told yourself some version of it 100 times. I'll start when I feel ready, when things calm down. When you have more time, when you're focused, when the right mindset finally arrives. But readiness, in the way you've been taught to imagine it, doesn't exist. Or at least not the way you think it does. Because what you're really waiting for isn't readiness. You're waiting for emotional certainty. That moment where fear vanishes, where doubt disappears, where energy flows. But that moment doesn't just appear. It's not something you wait for, it's something you generate. Readiness, as most people define it, is actually a side effect of action, not a prerequisite. When you move, even a little, the nervous system recalibrates. Dopamine shifts. Focus sharpens. Your identity begins to adjust. But none of that happens until motion begins. And the longer you wait to feel different before you act, the more you reinforce the belief that action must be earned. That effort only makes sense when conditions are perfect. But perfection never comes. And even if it did, it wouldn't be sustainable. Because readiness that's dependent on external calm or internal clarity is always vulnerable. It can disappear with a bad night of sleep, a text message, a spike of self-doubt. The truth is, most of the people who feel ready aren't more prepared than you. They've just trained their nervous systems to tolerate the discomfort of starting without feeling like it. They've stopped treating motivation as the gatekeeper of action. They act first and let readiness catch up. This is where the shift happens. When you realize that you don't need to be inspired, focused, or emotionally aligned to take the first step. You just need to reduce the emotional weight of that step enough to make it feel safe. That might mean shrinking the task. It might mean taking off the pressure to perform. It might mean starting without a goal, just to prove you can move. Not because you're being lazy, but because you're building trust. You're showing your system that motion doesn't require permission from your mood. And here's the paradox. The more you act without waiting to feel ready, the more often readiness shows up anyway. Because your brain begins to associate action with safety, not risk. With identity, not anxiety. With normalcy, not a big, dramatic shift. So stop waiting. Stop negotiating. Stop searching for the feeling that says, "Now's the time, it's not coming." Because the real turning point isn't a feeling. It's a moment. One where you choose to move, not because everything's aligned, but because your future is worth more than your comfort. And when you move through that moment, not by force, but by design, you teach your body something it forgot. You don't need to feel ready to begin. You need to begin to feel ready. A daily rewire. How to rebuild trust in your own momentum. Everyone wants consistency. Everyone talks about discipline. But very few people understand what actually sustains it. Not for a week, not during a phase, but over time. The truth is, real consistency doesn't begin with motivation. It begins with emotional trust. And that trust isn't something you think your way into. It's something you build, one interaction at a time, with your own nervous system. Your brain is always learning. Not in theory, but in feedback loops. It pays attention to what happens after you try, after you show up, after you move forward. And depending on how safe that experience feels, your system will either reinforce the behavior or learn to avoid it next time. This means every moment of hesitation is also a moment of reconditioning. The decision to start or not teaches your brain what it should expect from action. If starting always leads to overwhelm, shame, or fatigue, the brain will start flagging effort as a threat. But if starting feels neutral, manageable, and emotionally safe, even in small doses, your brain begins to relax around effort, and that's where trust is born. So what does that look like in practice? It starts with presence. The next time you feel resistance, pause. Not to force action, but to understand the signal. Ask yourself, what's the story playing in the background? What am I afraid this action might lead to? What would a safe version of this step look like right now, even if it's tiny? Then, take that version. Not the full project. Not the full routine. Just one small piece. Open the file. Stand up. Send the message. Do 2 minutes. Not because it will change everything, but because it signals to your body. Effort doesn't always mean danger. You don't do this to get results fast. You do it to rebuild your internal credibility. To show your nervous system, day after day, when I say I'll begin, I do. Not because I force it, because I make it safe. Over time, those tiny actions stack, not just in outcome, but in identity. The story shifts from, "I'm the kind of person who avoids hard things," to "I'm the kind of person who moves even when it's hard, because I know how to make it doable." This is the daily rewire. And it's not glamorous. It doesn't look impressive from the outside, but inside. It's doing the work of transforming effort from something your system avoids into something it trusts. That's what builds momentum, not pressure, not perfection, but repetition with safety, honesty without shame, and the quiet decision, made over and over, to move, not because you're forcing yourself, but because you're finally working with yourself. You weren't broken. You were misunderstood. There's a moment in every person's journey where something subtle shifts. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" And you start asking, what pattern have I been living inside? And why has no one ever explained it? Because for most of your life, you haven't just struggled with motivation. You've struggled with meaning, with identity, with the emotional weight of trying and still falling short. And in the absence of understanding, your mind filled in the blanks the only way it knew how. I must be lazy. I must be inconsistent. Maybe I'm just not wired like other people. But what if none of that was ever true? What if what you've called self-sabotage was actually a form of protection? What if your delays were a nervous system response, not a moral failure? What if your inability to start wasn't about weakness, but about the brain's memory of pain, shame, or emotional threat? Because when we zoom out and really look at it, most resistance doesn't begin with thought. It begins with sensation, with tension, with emotional echoes that rise before your conscious mind even catches them. Your body reacts, your focus scatters. You don't know why, so you blame yourself. Again, and that blame does something devastating. It builds a self-concept rooted in guilt. It tells you that effort is evidence of struggle. That discipline means war with yourself. That goals are promises you'll probably break. And so, even when you want to begin, something inside you doesn't believe you belong on the other side of completion. This is the quiet prison of misunderstood resistance. You don't just avoid the task, you avoid yourself. The version of you who's capable, who's clear, who's ready. Because meeting that version would require letting go of the story you've carried for so long. The one where you're the problem, but you're not the problem. You never were. You were a person trying to function within a nervous system that hadn't been shown how to feel safe with progress. You were a child who internalized the belief that effort equals pressure. You were a teenager who learned that trying too hard makes failure feel worse. You were an adult building a life on top of emotional blueprints you didn't choose, but kept repeating anyway. And now, you see it. That seeing, that's the shift. Not dramatic, not loud, but real. The moment you stop confusing your coping mechanisms with your identity is the moment you begin to rewrite everything. You're not someone who can't start. You're someone who's never been taught how to build emotional safety around movement. You're not someone who lacks motivation. You're someone whose internal system was too smart and too protective to move toward what it thought might hurt you. Now that you know, it's not about fixing yourself. It's about updating the conditions. Not to become someone new, but to finally become someone honest. And from that place, everything you do will come from alignment, not performance. That's what breaks the pattern. Not effort, not willpower, but truth. You don't need more motivation. You need less noise between you and who you already are. You've spent years believing the problem was motivation. That if you could just find the right system, the right mindset, the right burst of willpower, everything would finally click. But now you know better. The real barrier was never your ability. It was the invisible noise between your conscious desire and your unconscious wiring. That noise had many names: self-doubt, distraction, resistance, overthinking. But underneath all of it, there was just one signal trying to be heard: safety. Your brain wasn't blocking you to punish you. It was protecting you from effort that once hurt, from failure that once stung, from the emotional risk of becoming someone new before your body was ready to believe that version could survive. You were never weak. You were adaptive. You weren't undisciplined. You were loyal to a version of yourself that made sense at the time. But that version doesn't have to drive anymore. It can step aside. Not with shame, not with force, but with gratitude. Because what got you here isn't what will get you there. And now you know the difference. What happens next won't come from hype. It will come from honesty. From the quiet repetition of small, emotionally safe actions that say, I can begin. I can continue. I don't need to feel ready to move. You won't always feel motivated. But you'll feel something better, grounded, present, clear, and able to move, Not because you've won some internal war, but because there's no longer a war to fight. You've stopped trying to overcome yourself. You've started listening to yourself. That's the shift. That's the new foundation. From here forward, resistance won't disappear, but it won't own you either. You'll see it for what it is, a nervous system asking for reassurance, not a sign that you've failed, and you'll offer it. With clarity, with structure, with truth. Because now, the gap between intention and action is no longer filled with shame. It's filled with understanding. And that understanding is what changes everything, not overnight. Not in a dramatic breakthrough, but in a quiet, sustainable realignment between the self you've been protecting and the self you're finally ready to become.